In 1910, 5 of the most powerful men in America vanished from public view. They didn't tell their families where they were going. They didn't use their real names. And they didn't speak to reporters, employees, or even close friends. They boarded a train in the dead of night, carrying suitcases with no initials and wearing plain overcoats designed to blend in, not stand out. To anyone watching, it looked like a group of ordinary businessmen traveling south for the winter. But nothing about this trip was ordinary. These weren't tourists, and this wasn't a vacation. This was a mission, one so important and so dangerous that if anyone found out what they were planning, the entire American financial system could have collapsed on the spot. The men traveled under strict orders. Do not sit together. Do not speak each other's names. Do not acknowledge, anyone else on the train. Journalists back then were relentless, and a single overheard conversation could have exposed everything. After a 1,000-mile journey, the men arrived on a small, privately owned island off the coast of Georgia. Its name, Jekyll Island. To the public, it was known as a luxury resort for the rich. But on this trip, the resort was emptied. Staff were dismissed. No guests were allowed. The island became a sealed fortress because what these men were about to create would rewrite the rules of money, power, and control for the next century. And the strangest part, you still live under their system today. Every time you use a dollar, take out a loan, swipe a card, or make a purchase. For years, the U.S. economy had been collapsing in predictable cycles. Boom, crash, boom, crash. A big bank failure here, a liquidity panic there, and suddenly 1 million people were out of work. Wealth evaporated. Trust shattered. Every crisis was worse than the last. And politicians were powerless to fix it because almost all financial power sat in the hands of private banks that cared far more about profit than stability. So these 5 men, the richest and most strategically connected individuals in America, decided to bypass public debate and design a new system in secret, one that would guarantee stability, but would also consolidate more power into fewer hands than ever before. These weren't random faces. There was the Republican senator who controlled the banking legislation in Washington. There was the head of the nation's largest bank. There was the most influential investment banker on Wall Street, a man whose name alone could move markets. There was the assistant to the Treasury Secretary, representing the federal government while pretending he wasn't. And there was the quietest of them all, a young financial genius who had studied European central banks and knew exactly how to build one from scratch. Together, these 5 men represented about 1/4 of the world's total wealth at the time. And for the next 9 days, they locked themselves inside a mansion on Jekyll Island and worked in complete secrecy. No phones, no outside communication, no written notes that could be traced. They spoke quietly, argued fiercely, and drafted a blueprint that would shift economic power away from the American public and into the hands of a centralized authority, an authority that would eventually be known as the Federal Reserve. But here's the twist. The plan wasn't framed as a public service. It was a survival strategy for the elites. The banking tycoons were terrified. They'd nearly lost everything during the panic of 1907, and they knew one more financial meltdown could destroy their empires. So their goal was simple: build a system that protected the banks from collapse, even if ordinary citizens suffered the consequences. And they needed to do it secretly, because if the American people learned that a handful of bankers were designing the nation's future money system, there would have been riots in the streets. Every detail had to be hidden. That's why the men used fake names on the train. Why they told their families they were on hunting trips. Why they wouldn't even allow servants inside the dining room. And why the island remained completely sealed while they worked. They created a plan that gave a central bank the power to print money, regulate interest rates, rescue failing institutions, and control how much liquidity flowed through the economy. But they didn't call it a central bank. Americans hated central banks. So they wrapped it in softer language. Federal Reserve, regional banks, public oversight. It sounded democratic, decentralized, safe. In reality, the structure was designed to keep decision-making in the hands of the same people who wrote the plan. For nearly a decade, the truth stayed buried. Reporters suspected something. Rumors leaked, but everyone denied it. The men refused to confirm their involvement until they were old. Some took the secret to their graves, and yet the system they designed now decides everything from the value of the dollar to the cost of your rent to whether your savings grow or shrink. It influences wars, elections, recessions, and recoveries. It determines who gets rich, who goes bankrupt, and who controls the future of global finance. And it all started because 5 men boarded a train in the middle of the night and quietly decided how your money works today. But what people don't realize is that the meeting wasn't just about preventing financial crises. There was a deeper fear, one that came from Europe, from the collapse of nations overseas, from a pattern that these men saw forming beneath the surface of modern banking, a pattern they were desperate to stop before it consumed America next. And that part of the story is where things get even darker. What the public never knew, what the newspapers never printed, was that the 1910 meeting on Jekyll Island wasn't just about stabilizing the US economy, it was about fear, a very specific fear. In the early 1900s, Europe was tearing itself apart. Banks in Germany were collapsing under pressure from speculative bubbles. Britain was drowning in war debts stretching all the way back to the Boer Wars. Russia's financial system was so unstable it helped trigger a revolution that toppled an empire. And all across Europe, one pattern kept repeating. When private banking interests gained too much power, the entire national economy eventually imploded from corruption, panic, and uncontrolled credit. These 5 men who had access to every private cable message, every foreign banking report, every classified financial alert had studied these European failures in detail. They understood that America was next. The US was already showing the same symptoms: rapidly expanding credit, wildly speculative markets, zero federal oversight, politicians being bribed by corporate bankers, and ordinary citizens put in their savings into unregulated institutions that could collapse overnight. The panic of 1907 was just a warning shot, and these men knew it. They knew the next crash wouldn't just wipe out a few banks, it could destroy the entire US financial system and burn their fortunes to the ground with it. So on Jekyll Island, they crafted something new, a hybrid creature that looked democratic on the outside but operated like a private cartel on the inside. Their logic was chillingly simple. If they could not eliminate financial crises, they would at least control the timing, the scale, and the fallout of those crises. Better a controlled burn than a wildfire. Better a recession than a revolution. And better the illusion of public oversight than the reality of public anger. But as the men worked late into the night, drawing diagrams, designing flowcharts, arguing over influence, something else became clear. They weren't just designing a banking system, they were designing leverage. A tool that could be used to influence elections, shape government behavior, and push the nation toward policies that benefited their businesses and protected their fortunes. They created a structure where the government would appear to regulate the banks, while the banks, behind closed doors, would guide the government. It was the perfect feedback loop. Money influencing power, power influencing money. And once the loop was formed, no outsider could break it. Not the president, not Congress, not the American people. Inside the mansion, the discussions grew tense. Some wanted full private control. Others warned that too much greed would expose them. The final compromise was elegant. A central entity with the word federal in its name, making the public believe it was government on demand, though most of the control would remain in private hands. Multiple regional banks to create the appearance of decentralization. Although the New York district, controlled by Wall Street, would hold most of the real power. A board appointed by the president to make it look democratic, even though the board would be fed information, guidance, and direction by the very bankers who rode the system. And a promise that the Federal Reserve would never be allowed to directly fund government deficits, even though, within decades, that rule would be quietly bypassed, opening the door to endless war financing, massive national debt, and inflation that silently steals wealth from anyone who holds dollars. By the 7th day, the men had built a monetary machine that could expand credit at will, rescue failing banks, manipulate interest rates, and act as the lender of last resort, the ultimate financial backstop that would prevent the economy from falling into European-style collapse. But they had also created something else, a system so complex, so technical, and so buried in economic jargon that the average citizen would never understand how it worked. Even experts today argue over what the Federal Reserve truly is: a government agency, a private corporation, a hybrid syndicate, a cartel. The answer is yes, it is all of those things, by design. As the final documents were drafted on Jekyll Island, one of the men reportedly said, "If the plan we created were exposed to the public, it would be rejected instantly." He wasn't exaggerating. If America knew that 5 men representing the richest families in the country had rewritten the nation's financial DNA behind closed doors, the plan would have been dead on arrival. Riots, protests, congressional investigations, everything they were trying to prevent would have exploded immediately. So they developed a strategy to pass their plan into law without anyone realizing who had created it. First, they renamed it the Aldrich Plan, named after Senator Nelson Aldrich, would never pass because Aldrich was widely seen as a servant of the bankers. So they distanced the bankers, changed the language, softened the tone, and reintroduced the plan under a new identity, a patriotic-sounding, citizen-friendly reform package designed to prevent future financial panics. Then they enlisted professors, journalists, and economists, many of whom were quietly funded by the same banking families, to write articles, publish books, and give public speeches claiming the US desperately needed a central monetary authority. They pushed the narrative that the American people would be safer, richer, and more secure under this new system, and it worked. Public opinion began to shift. Newspapers began to repeat the same talking points. Politicians began to echo the same arguments. Meanwhile, the five men remained completely silent, denying everything, pretending they barely knew each other, standing in the shadows while their creation moved through Congress disguised as a public good. On December 23, 1930, days before Christmas when most lawmakers were absent, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. America went to sleep under one banking system and woke up under an entirely different one designed in secret, optimized for elite survival, protected from public control, and destined to dominate the next century of economic life. But the real power of the system wouldn't be revealed until the next crisis, because the first time the Federal Reserve used its new authority, the entire world would learn just how much influence those five men had engineered for themselves. And what happened next would change global finance forever. And here's where the story stops being a financial mystery and becomes a global warner. Because once the Jekyll Island blueprint quietly turned into the Federal Reserve in 1913, those same invisible principles spread across the world like a silent empire, reshaping governance, triggering collapses, and creating a system where money could be created out of nothing, controlled by no voter, and regulated by no election. The first major test came immediately with World War I, when the Fed's ability to expand credit allowed the United States to lend billions to Europe, money created from thin air that pulled America into a war it was never meant to join. When the war ended, the debts didn't, and the pressure to collect them crushed Germany, helped fuel the Great Depression, and gave rise to a dictator who promised to destroy the financial system built by bankers. Then in World War II, the same central banking structures financed the largest military mobilization in human history, proving that whoever controlled the creation of money controlled the direction of civilizations. After the war, the system went global through Bretton Woods, giving the US dollar a throne over the world economy. But behind that symbol was the same idea born in the shadows of Jekyll Island. Money was no longer a thing, it was a decision that a few people had the power to make, and when countries tried to escape, they were punished. In the 1950s and 60s, France demanded real gold instead of dollars. America responded by pulling the entire world off the gold standard in 1971, redefining money again with no vote from the public. In the 1980s, Latin American countries tried resisting dollar debt. Their economies collapsed under banking pressure. In the 1990s, Asian nations attempted to build independent financial systems. A crisis conveniently wiped them out in months. Each time, the message was the same as the one decided at Jekyll Island: your economy survives only if it stays inside the architecture designed by the private financial elite. But here's the twist: your competitor never explains this system isn't stable. It's aging, cracking, and spiraling toward a point its creators never expected: total dependency on ever-growing debt. The Fed must print to keep markets from falling, must inflate to keep governments from defaulting, must intervene to stop banks from collapsing. It's a machine that can't turn off without destroying itself, and the world sees it. That's why China, Russia, India, Brazil, the Middle East, and even us allies are rapidly building alternative payment systems, gold-backed exchanges, crypto-based trade networks, and military alliances that allow them to function outside the dollar. For the first time since Jekyll Island, the world is preparing for the moment the system fails. And here's the part no one wants to hear: the collapse won't look like 1929 or 2008. It will look like a global realignment, where the countries holding real resources, energy, food, minerals, gain power, while the countries relying on financial engineering lose control. A world where inflation doesn't cool down because it becomes permanent. A world where interest rates spike not because the Fed chooses it, but because the world stops trusting the dollar. A world where the United States is forced to defend its currency the way it once defended its territory: aggressively, publicly, and possibly violently. The story that began on a private island with five men deciding how money should work is now entering its final act. The moment when a system built on secrecy meets a world demanding transparency, and the moment when the people who designed the modern economies realize the one thing they could never control is the collapse of trust. Because once trust disappears, money disappears with it. The biggest financial revelation of the 21st century won't be a new currency, a new technology, or a new bank. It will be the realization that the world has quietly outgrown the system founded at Jekyll Island, and the next global financial order is already forming just as secretly, just as strategically, and possibly with consequences far greater than anything those five men ever imagined. And when that transition hits, people will finally understand the truth behind the most important financial meeting in history. Your money, your future, and your country have always been shaped by conversations you were never allowed to hear.